This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome everyone to Software Engineering Radio today. My name's Kim Carter, I'll be your host, and today we've got Haroon Meer as guest. Haroon Meer is the founder of Thinkst, the company behind the well-loved Thinkst Canary tools. Haroon has contributed to several books on information security and has published a number of papers on various topics related to the field. Over the past decade and a half, Haroon has delivered research, talks and keynotes at conferences around the world, and there's quite a long list. So welcome to the show today, Haroon.
Thanks for having me.
Most types of security exploitation have a network involved somewhere, even though in some cases it may be abstracted. The Yahoo data breaches are a good example of this. Reconnaissance, which is the act of information gathering, generally utilises the internet at a minimum. Application security generally requires a network in order to access the target applications. Cloud security similarly depends on a network in order to access target resources. Social engineering leverages a network of people in order to access a human target. Even physical security often involves different types of networks. Today, we're going to be discussing the different types of networks, including the ones we often don't think about. What are your assets an attacker may target? What are the risks to those assets? And the types of countermeasures we need to be thinking about in order to mitigate the risks. There are some relevant articles from the IEEE Computer Society on today's topic, such as Computer Network Security and Defense Technology Research, Security Defenses for Vulnerable Medical Sensor Networks, and the Network Perspective of Cloud Security, all found at computer.org/CSDL. We had a show on Docker security with Diego Monica, that was show number 290. And we've also looked at bringing the security focus up front with a show on DevSecOps with Francis Reynard. That was show number 288. Now the lines between the different types of security, that's physical, people, VPS, network, cloud, application, mobile and IoT, are sometimes blurred, and in many cases are being pushed to application security, network security, and often into the cloud. Let's start with some basic questions, Haroon. What is network security and what is application security, and how are they different?
Right. I think at its simplest, network security is policies, procedures to protect network-connected resources. And your application security would be policies, procedures, measures taken to improve the security posture of your apps. But having said this, the lines were a lot clearer 10 to 15 years ago. Because these days you've got infrastructure that's actually software, you've got software-defined everything. And one of the things that's plagued us historically from a security point of view is you'll often find that your infrastructure is actually someone else's code. And by this I mean, if you take it at its simplest, network security would typically worry about setting up your host, setting up your network, while your developers worked on the code that they ran on those platforms. But if you ponder it, even the servers that you run on were some software house's code, right? So the lines blur interestingly, and increasingly they blur more and more.
Just as with any other form of security, the first thing we need to think about is what's valuable to us in regards to a network security. What are we attempting to protect and why? Like, what are our assets?
Right. So what's interesting is a little while back, there's a really smart security guy called FX who put out a paper, and it's worth checking out. It was back in like 2014. He put out a paper called Back to Basics. And one of the interesting things that FX touches on in that paper is he says that today we've got to acknowledge that almost all the systems we have are actually composite systems. And then goes on to say that we keep talking about security as if there's a critical gate, but you need to understand that in a composite system, everything's a gate. And so it becomes interesting to note that even if you're dealing with some level of abstraction, like you've got some ring fence around you working on the code, what that code is running on matters, how reachable those hosts are matter, how many other parts there are to that host matter, what the dependencies of that host are matter. And yeah, somebody's got to be making sure that all of that stuff is looked at and considered from a security point of view. The stuff that you just mentioned, which is knowing what assets you actually have, is surprisingly overlooked and surprisingly not a well-solved problem in many large enterprises. You see companies now trying to do this sort of thing with asset management, but in a previous life, for example, we did a lot of network-based penetration testing, and we'd spend about 40% of an engagement just footprinting the organization, just figuring out what they had and where they had it. Because often we'd manage to break in not because of some cunning 0-day, but just because we were able to find some step into their network that they didn't know still existed.
Yeah, so good reconnaissance, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the comments I received recently was, as a software engineer, do I really care about physical network security? Why should software engineers care?
Yeah, so I think this goes back a little bit to FX's point about the security of a composite system. It doesn't matter how secure your code is, if you're building it on a house of cards, you're going to have a bad day. So yeah, ultimately it comes down to the security of your application. And if your application's being made insecure because of design choices or architecture choices effectively beneath you in the stack, then that stuff's going to have a very real impact on you. And I guess it depends ultimately on what you're trying to do in your job or in your career. You could probably take the view that says, I swim in my lane and don't care about anything else. But if you plan to ship code that stands up to a reasonable attack, you probably need to at least understand the basics.
The other thing is, as software engineers, we're actually building networks in the cloud with configuration as code, right?
Increasingly, you're seeing configuration as code, and increasingly you're seeing you've mentioned that you've spoken to SecDevOps or at least DevOps folks, and increasingly those lines blur completely. And one of the things to keep in mind is with us as pen testers or even just as attackers, there's an old quote that essentially says that we basically live between the cracks. So it's anywhere that these cracks appear, either when it's two systems that are joining together or two roles in an organization that join together. It's perfectly the place where attackers and pen testers live.
Yeah. What's changed with computer network security over the last 5 to 10 years?
Depends on how cynical you are on any given day. So the super cynical answer is not enough. And mainly you say that because pretty famously old pen testers like to point out that you can still own most customer networks just like it's the early 2000s. So there's still poor segmentation, there's still poor design choices proliferating there. The ray of sunshine through all of this is with the move to cloud, people had the opportunity to re-architect. With the move to things like Google's Beyond Corp, you're starting to see the promise of new designs. And almost with the new type of containerization and microservices, you're starting to see a different architecture emerge that maybe gives us some hope. And one of the big things is some vendors have learned their lessons. So in the early 2000s, network hosts, you could go onto any network and own Microsoft boxes with a vast array of exploits. Microsoft's been working pretty hard for the last 15 years to make sure that their hosts were reasonably harder. And now you're starting to see the promise of hosts that actually stand up pretty well. Like if you look at where so not Android, God no. If you're starting to look at where Google Chromebooks are going or where iOS is going, you're starting to see the promise of hosts that can stand up to reasonable attack by skilled attackers.
Has this shifted the reliance that your average attacker used to have on network security exploitation skills to other areas such as cloud services, application security, and of course people? And if so, how so?
Yeah, so I think there's always a shift. So there's two parts to this, right? The one part is the bad news, and the bad news there is that attackers are always shifting, and they're able to do it a little bit quicker because they get to cherry pick their knowledge. So they get to do deep dives just on bits that give them super great wins, while defenders have to do some of the boring infrastructure bits because they need to be done. And so, yeah, there's definitely been a move. You've seen attackers move up into the application stack because over the last while, applications become the gateways to networks and essentially to the crown jewels. So a long time ago, before web apps started proliferating, there was the concept that maybe people could shut down their networks and not permit much. And more people started opening applications up to the world, and now a web server is the interface essentially to the database backend. So attackers don't need to own your network and map out your network and find where the database server is and obtain creds and log in to steal the data. He just needs to find the flaw in your web application because that's making those database calls anyway. So on the one end, stuff has certainly moved towards the app layer. Social engineering is as old as it gets, but it never goes away. And one of the reasons it never goes away is because it's so shockingly effective. Pen testers like to act like they're really skilled at social engineering, but the simple answer is it's just an easy game to win. When we were a pen testing company, we literally had to stop our junior pen testers from taking things too far, because once they figured out that they could just lie and cheat and win on pen test engagements, they literally started outdoing themselves with the outrageous stuff they could get away with. Like literally you had guys stealing entire computers and databases from target sites because the target would walk them in. It makes for a fun job.
Yeah, it does. According to FBI investigators, the likely avenue of infiltration of the Yahoo internal network was with a spear phishing email to a semi-privileged, unsuspecting, inadvertent Yahoo employee. The successful spear phish allowed the attackers direct access to Yahoo's internal network. What are your thoughts about the fact that the attacker just about always still needs a network in order to access their target, whether the initial foothold be physical, people, VPSs, network components, or whatever?
Yeah, so look, without shilling for the product we sell, like I think it's a stupid problem that so many years into it, attacks still look so similar to how old attacks did. And like if you take that entry vector, which is somebody gets phished, they get compromised, and from that point they move laterally into a network, find the juicy stuff, and then run away with it. That stuff reads like any pen test report from the late 90s or 2000s. And the truth is, that's still how most attacks look against most people. And yeah, that stuff's not going away for a long time. Like people with big hulking legacy networks are still running with exactly those sorts of problems. And for the most part, a little while back, the industry started pivoting and saying, listen, we can't stop every vector. Like either you're going to phish Jim from accounting, or you're going to give Jim from accounting a USB disk on his cover of Golf Monthly, or you're going to own him at the coffee shop and he's going to walk the malware into the organization like there's a squillion entry points because Jim is Jim. What we should do instead is move to the point where we can detect it quickly enough and contain it quickly enough. So you're not playing this constant game of catch up with attack vectors, which really dominated network and host security guys thinking in the early 2000s. We really thought that we could patch our way out of that problem. And then people started saying, hey, listen, that's just increased complexity. And that complexity problem just gets worse and worse and worse, right? Like I gave a talk a few years ago where I tried to point out how complexity is just going to keep giving us gray hair. And the stuff you can pick up on is ridiculous. Like the three quick examples that come to mind are a little while back, the guys from one of the Mac houses, so it's not even a security shop, took a hacksaw to one of these video adapters because it wasn't giving them the results they expected. And they found that there's a system on a chip in your adapters with 2 gigs of RAM. So literally your video transcoder cable, your video adapter, is another computer. And a little while after that, one of the guys from CrowdStrike published research that showed that every modern monitor actually has a x86 processor running in that. And then just to top it off, Bunny Huang, the guy who's done the famous Xbox hacks, a few years ago did a talk where he showed that there's tiny processors on SD cards that can be reflashed and reprogrammed. So literally these 20-cent pieces of plastic are actually little computers. And so the complexity and the number of vectors are off the charts. And so instead, what you've got to do is figure out that you've got all these pieces that you can't trust that could be compromised from a bunch of different ways. What you need to do is have containment and detection so that you know when stuff is behaving abnormally, or you realize when stuff is getting really horrible, and you can then react to it and take it from there.
So have you got some tips around that, like around containment and detection? I mean, how do we go about doing that?
This is a straight up layup. So look, there's a guy called Marcus Ranum, and Marcus Ranum wrote the first Tisk firewall like many moons ago. So at this point, Marcus is still incredibly smart, incredibly insightful, but an incredible curmudgeon, because he looks at everything and says, well, I told you guys what to do 20 years ago. Why aren't you doing it yet? And he normally goes back to real basics. Well, have tiered architecture, have organize your networks this way. You should know if any of your servers make an outbound connection. And while Marcus is incredibly smart, one of the things that you figure out is if nobody's doing this, then like you're fighting human nature, something's stopping them from doing this. And one of the things that we do as a company is we build these tiny devices that live on your network. We call them canaries, from the old canary in a coal mine. And part of what Canary does is you drop it on your network in a bunch of different locations. And the whole logic is that when an attacker breaks into your network and then starts this lateral movement, at that point, the attacker's got to go through a type of internal reconnaissance phase. And inadvertently, what he does is ends up touching one of your canaries. So the canary becomes a simple, low-cost way to figure out that someone on your network is now touching things that he shouldn't be touching. But without pumping our own product, part of the simple logic for containment and detection like that is to have different trust zones, right? Like at this point, there's no excuse on a traditional network to not have different trust zones. And I say on a traditional network because the whole Google Beyond Corp thing is something that bears mention. We should probably circle around to at some point. But on a traditional network, there's really no excuse. If I compromise a server in your DMZ, that server should never be initiating connections to anyone. Or if it is, there's a short list of servers it should be talking to. But what most pen testers and what most attackers will tell you is you attack one machine, and that very quickly leads to the ability to touch other machines or the ability to exfiltrate data. And yeah, that's where lots of people's nightmares end up coming from.
Can you explain what network segmentation is and what are some of the risks that are likely to occur if a well thought out segmentation isn't implemented?
Right. So with segmentation, essentially the logic that you're going for is that you classing your servers, your users, into zones of different trust. Essentially, you're saying, look, I need these servers to be touching the internet, and therefore I assign a certain level of taint to them in my head. Like, I'm going to assume that at some point this server could get popped because it is exposed to users to the unwashed internet. And then you have your database servers, and you'd say, okay, I'm going to allow only the web server to talk to this database farm. And this database farm should never be able to initiate connections elsewhere. And of course, the problem with this is networks atrophy. So even a well-designed network today in 3 months has gone through various iterations of just plug it in and make it work. And in the enterprise, people are rewarded for making stuff work, not necessarily making stuff secure. So people over time just end up with situations where you've got one big flat network. Even if you originally tried some level of segmentation, that stuff quickly disappears. But with the original model or with the original thinking, you'd have these different zones, and then you'd have some sort of alerting when cross-zone communication was going to happen. So it's really easy to tell if one of your web servers suddenly tried to initiate a connection with a host in China, because none of your web servers should be trying outbound connections. And that's the original logic, but it's surprisingly missing in the real world.
Apparently most of our IoT devices need to have internet access.
Yeah, it's IoT. I'm sure at some point you'll get an IoT specialist on. But IoT, one of the things that it seems to be doing, it seems to do two things. Like it seems to be bringing back all our fun bugs from the 90s. And the other thing is it seems to be bringing back all the poor design decisions that we made in the 90s. And yeah, if you've got these IoT devices that require direct connections, I know some organizations are putting them on a separate network, but then what you find is you have IoT devices that bridge both networks because they also enrolling in Active Directory or also hopping onto your wireless LANs. And I think for the most part, this goes back to my question of complexity. Like you didn't think that your kettle needed to be included in your threat model, but it increasingly looks like it probably should be.
Yeah, it seems like one of the problems also is that little thoughts being put into building security into the actual components.
Yeah.
Would that be your take as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's something that people have been complaining about for a long time, and I think in truth, like there's a much deeper issue, right? Like it's really easy for us to say the thought's not being put in, but like if you're reasonable, at some point you stop and say, well, hold on, why is nobody putting this thought into it? And you get into a dark gray place there, because what you figure out is it's just economics, right? And there's very little incentive to do it right, because the market doesn't seem to reward that. The market currently seems to reward the people who get there first and claim the land. And so there's a few people who are big proponents of some sort of software liability. I'm not quite sure where I sit on it, because in part the reason we managed to get the internet to where it is in just a few years is because you had browsers that accepted anything, and we had 15-year-old kids writing internet banking and internet pay card systems. So yeah, it's an interesting one, because to get to the incentives, it seems like you're going to have to get to the point where there's some sort of liability talk, but I suspect that in turn hampers innovation also. And so we're going to have to figure out a way to get that right.
How would you go about providing a network segmentation for IoT devices? You got any thoughts around that?
For IoT specifically, and look, this advice would go into almost any question like this. Like typically, what you'd look at is what the object in question needs to access, and like I say, if we go back to my question on detection, the question would be, what do I need to do to tell if this thing turns rogue? Like if this thing turns evil, what can it get at right now, or how bad can it get? And then the second part would be, would I know if this thing turned evil or became someone's proxy? So in general, with IoT, I'd try to keep it isolated off the company network or off the company's corp network. And if it needed access to the corp network, I'd at least want to know what it's doing. You're starting to get, and I don't think products are generally the answer. Like I think understanding your threat model and then designing well is generally your best step. But I know there are products right now, like the guys at Senrio have a product that you drop on your network and they then watch for your IoT traffic and then use machine learning to try to tell you when one of those devices start talking in a way that they don't normally talk. But for the most part, my pitch there would be that you'd have to design the security in from a network point of view to cater for the fact that the vendor probably hasn't.
Almost sounds like a lost cause.
For the most part, parts of it, like part of the, okay, we're now going to do containment and detection. Like some people do see that as a little bit fatalist because they'd like to believe that actually you can harden every device against attack. And for the most part, I'm willing to bet that that's a failing strategy and one you'd permanently fail on. And instead, my suggestion, like I said, is almost always to aim for a way that you can get some sort of network segregation in place and then some sort of network detection in place to know when, air quotes, bad stuff is happening.
I'm just going to move into a bit of a discussion around the fortress or candy bar mentality. So this is where organisations believe that all their attackers are on the outside of the organisation and those on the inside are trustworthy. What are your thoughts around this?
Well, for the one thing, it's what kept most pen testers and attackers looking smart all of these years, right? Because it's essentially the attacker gets his one foothold into the network, and at that point he's on the soft and chewy inside and no longer from the hard and crunchy exterior. And like I say, that thinking is so pervasive that attacking lots of these networks just doesn't look very different to attacking these networks in the late 90s. Like once you're inside the network, you're exposed to all of these hosts that have never been patched or are woefully out of date. You're exposed to horrible trust relationships. It basically becomes shooting fish in a barrel. And again, if you take what I've said repeatedly, the fact that there are so many vectors into a network these days, the logic that says we can afford to be soft on the inside is just not a realistic one. It's where solutions like Google's BeyondCorp, I mentioned BeyondCorp a few times, it's probably worth at least a 2-line overview. BeyondCorp is Google's implementation of a perimeterless network. And obviously it's a whole new paradigm, and it requires a lot of architecting and a lot of thinking. If someone moves to a BeyondCorp infrastructure, the essential logic is that there's no difference between a user who's sitting at his desk at HQ or sitting at a coffee shop or working from home. There's no inherent trust that one's location makes a difference. And you can see why Google would go there, because if you architect for a world where you no longer trust the network especially, then you've got to harden the other parts of your network like you should, or the other parts of your system like you should. And so Google's documented their implementation of this pretty extensively in a few papers. Like I say, they call it Beyond Corp. It's certainly worth checking out for users, for listeners who are interested in that sort of thing.
The IBM X-Force Cybersecurity Intelligence Index researches a large number of organisations each year, and they've extracted some interesting data. I'll miss out some of the earlier years, but 2015, they had 60% of all attacks were carried out by insiders. 44.5% were malicious inside actors, and 15.5% were inadvertent inside actors. In 2016, we see 30% of all attacks were carried out by insiders, 7% were malicious inside actors, 23% were inadvertent inside actors. The Yahoo data breach and many others every day confirm that a large percentage of all security breaches come from within the organisation's walls. Do you think that this is an indicator that our workers are succumbing to an increased number of social engineering attacks by outside attackers attempting to get their payloads inside the organisation's networks?
Yeah, look, like I said, the social engineering stuff's going to be around for a long time because it's that easy and it's that effective. If you talk to any of the hardcore security researchers who've been doing deep application security or researching on complex next generation attacks for like 15 years, you'll often find them with tears in their eyes because they've spent all this time working on advanced memory corruption attacks that work in the face of built-in compiler mitigations and OS mitigations. And they manage to find ways to hijack execution flow. And actually, you've got all these networks falling down to effectively someone mailing them saying, please transfer money or please give me access to your network, and it still works. So for sure, social engineering is still shockingly effective. And a lot of people believe that the answer is to train your way out of it. I think there's something to be said for training your staff. Like it beats having completely untrained staff. But for the most part, again, I think what we need to get to is architecting solutions for them that don't require them to do the right thing. And this flies a little bit in the face of lots of people's thoughts that say you need to train your users and educate your users because they're your best defense. Like in truth, for any non-trivial sized company, I think you're going to have some guy in accounts or some lady in marketing who's not going to get that URL reads, like trustworthiness reads from left to right and not right to left. So secure.bank.com is not the same as com.bank.secure. Which is a completely different domain. And the number of tricks that you can pull like that, like it's completely ridiculous to believe that you could tell a user all of these tricks. Like you get people who go, well, just teach them to hover over the link in Outlook. But that's kind of naive. There's a squillion ways to convince someone why that link is genuine. A, from just implementing network trickery, but B, even just the fact that social engineering relies on people and convincing people to do stuff for you. And fundamentally, we social beings and want to help each other.
For our listeners, can you define what command and control is?
Sure. So normally people talk about command and control when they've compromised a host. So you've compromised a host or a series of hosts, and you now need some way to talk to that host remotely. And so traditionally these compromised hosts would have some sort of command and control channel that goes back to the internet or goes back to the attacker somehow, so that they can now communicate with these compromised hosts on your network. And over the years, you've seen that evolve and get cleverer and cleverer, hoping, like, if networks get better designed, you'd need more cunning command and control channels to try and effectively control the hosts that you own on that target network. Again, it's one of those things that are almost a losing game for defenders unless they've really got their segmentation done right and got their detection done right. Over the years, we've pulled some ridiculous tricks to get out of even tightly controlled networks. Yeah, it's an attacker's game for sure.
So how can we stop insiders and outsiders connecting to our network access points and proliferating malware, command and control clients, etc. onto our corporate networks?
So if you're talking about malicious insiders, yeah, it's like no matter what anyone tells you, like if there's an insider who really wants to do bad stuff and he's got some measure of access, it's going to be really hard for you to stop him. Like if he's clueful, and so if you take the thought of a command and control channel, at this point almost everyone's heard of Stuxnet, but many moons before Stuxnet, we did an assessment on a client network, and the client believed that they were completely safe because they were on a completely air-gapped network. And all we did on their network was we wrote some software that when it was on their machine would steal all of their data and then wait till a USB was plugged in, a USB stick was plugged in. And when a USB stick was plugged in, it would then hop onto the USB stick. And every time that USB stick was plugged in somewhere else, the first thing it would do was check if it had access to the internet. And if it had access to the internet, would then post all of that data to the comments of some blog site. So effectively, it would hop onto USB sticks, hoping somebody would carry it out of the network at some point. And it worked. And to the same end, if I'm a malicious binary running on your network, I've got a bunch of options to try to find my way out of your network. People talk about DNS exfiltration. Effectively, instead of making a direct connection to the internet, making DNS requests and passing my traffic through valid DNS traffic. But actually, there's a host of different options. So effectively, what you'd want is tight control of your endpoints, and again, detection of outbound traffic so that you'd know when silliness like this was happening on your network.
On the topic of exfiltration and infiltration, what are some of the techniques and tools commonly used?
Yeah, so if we're talking about infiltration, there's a number of ways into your network, right? So you've mentioned phishing a few times, and again, it's painful how stupid and successful that is. Like you literally just a step removed from mailing someone a file and saying, please run this file. Like it's only slightly more abstracted than that. So instead, you're sending them an Excel file which asks them to enable macros, or you're sending them some other file format that they didn't know actually masked executable content. And again, as a throwback, the problem here, the root problem is complexity, right? Because it turns out that every Excel file can actually embed shockwave flash, which can actually run content on the user's machine. So yeah, getting in, there's a bunch of ways. So either you get in because you phished someone, or you get in because you've managed to infect something in these guys' supply chain. So somewhere on the internal network, they're running a binary that they think they can trust, but they actually shouldn't. Or you've compromised some service. So through the internet, you've attacked some application. And if you take a simple attack out of the 2000s, if there's a standard LAMP service or web app that's sitting there, and you manage to get yourself a SQL injection attack going, well, now you're executing code on the database server. And so as an attacker, your view now pivots, right? It doesn't matter that you sitting on the outside of the network. Once you execute code as the database server, you become the database server, and your view is anything that the database server sees, and your credentials are anything that the database server has control of. And we spent, as pen testers, we spent stupid amounts of time making that stuff comfortable for ourselves. So if you imagine a standard SQL injection attack, in around 2009, we had toolkits built for ourselves that if we could pull off SQL injection against your server, then we could pretty much load a proxy on our network that would essentially tunnel complete TCP traffic through that SQL injection attack to the other side of your network. So if you had an RDP server inside your network that your SQL server could talk to, because of the SQL injection attack, we could literally just RDP from our network straight through to the RDP server on the inside of your network. And that data would be passing through your web server, through the database server, and then going out as a TCP stream. And that's why I say at that point, it's only down to how creative your attacker is. He'll find a path through that. And if we take just a moment more on that, just because it's worth noting how much attackers do with how little access. If you take the standard SQL injection attack from the 2002s, I'd put in bad data in your form field. It gets passed off to your SQL server. Your SQL server then interprets this as SQL code and either spits back to a page that I can read or spits back an error message that I can now use as an oracle to figure out what's going on. And so what you started getting were people who were incredibly good, or tools that were incredibly good at pulling data off a SQL server from web page error messages. And people started figuring out that you don't send debug messages back prod. And so then what attackers started doing is started figuring out different ways to get that data out. And again, around 2008, I think, we did a talk that we called Pushing the Camel Through the Eye of the Needle. For one thing, because we're extremely bad at choosing talk titles. But essentially, what we were going for was new ways to get data in and out of networks. And so if you take that progression with the first attack, we're reading error messages. The second one I already touched on is I can find a way to tell your SQL server to do a DNS lookup. Okay, and if we're sticking with SQL server, there's a bunch of ways I can make your SQL server do a DNS lookup. For one thing, your SQL server has stored procedures that take UNC paths as parameters. So I can tell it, run the stored procedure, and the UNC path is me.com. Your SQL server then has to resolve that UNC path. It does a DNS request for me.com. And so if I'm looking at my DNS server logs, I can now tell that someone just did a lookup for me.com. And if you take that as a simple primitive that says, I can make you do a DNS lookup and view the results, you can see where that goes, right? I can start saying, well, okay, tell me what files are on your machine. And for every file that's on your machine, do a lookup for filename.me.com. And then sitting on my DNS server, I see requests coming in for a.bat.me.com and win.ini.me.com. And of course, that's just the very basic way of doing it. What you'd quickly get to is the point where you'd say, let's encode this data so that we can make it binary safe, and then do the lookup. And so we built toolkits so that you'd be able to do that and completely transfer binaries through DNS if you needed to. And the only thing that's happening there is the SQL server is making DNS requests. Like the only thing that would be visible there is that SQL server making DNS requests. And to go back to the question then on what should be happening, one of the things that you'd often find out is your SQL server does not need to make DNS requests, or certainly doesn't need a DNS resolver that talks all the way to the internet. And so that extra functionality should be getting cut. Just to labor that point for people who aren't tired of it yet, if DNS requests was a cool looking stunt to get data out, sometime later we figured out that you could essentially run your SQL injection attack. And so we started bumping into networks where even DNS wasn't allowed out. And even there, with a little bit of effort and outside the box thinking, what we figured is, well, what I can do is I can tell your SQL server sleep 10. And if I can tell your SQL server to sleep 10, or I can give it a computationally intensive command to run, I can look at your web server or your web app and see that it's become unresponsive for 10 seconds. And so again, that becomes a primitive. So we can say, list the files on your system. If your file is a.bat, take the first character. It's an A, which is binary 110111. If it's a 1, sleep 10. If it's a 0, sleep 0. And then read the amount of times or the durations that your app is unresponsive for. And essentially, you then get a timing channel. And because we're building tools all the time to make this stuff easy, at the end of it, you have a tool that essentially lets you choose what's your communication channel with this host. And you say error messages, or you say DNS, or you say timing. And then you never have to think about it again. That thing's abstracted away for you. And it's essentially just you and what you want to do.
What are some of the countermeasures we could put in place to stop these types of attacks happening?
Yeah, so attacks like that, there's multiple things that can be done to protect against it and to detect it. Like in that one, I was talking SQL injection, and essentially SQL injection is essentially a dev problem, right? Like what you need to be doing is using bind variables, or not just concatenating SQL queries that users give you and throwing untrusted input at your database server. So there's good solutions for all of these individual problems, but I think the takeaway, if nothing else, other than completely annoying your listeners, the takeaway that your listeners should take is as attackers, we spend an incredible amount of time working on really small cracks. And it's literally where the attackers play, is finding these really small holes and turning them into beachheads that we can use to attack the rest of the network. So in that case, it's secure development practice, right, to prevent the SQL injection attack in the first place. It's network segmentation and architecture to make sure that if we're running commands on your database server, we don't have easy access out, because we resort to timing and DNS when we can't make a direct connection out. And so the trick is to make it increasingly hard for attackers. So either they move on because you're not worth their effort, or you find ways to trip them up so that you can actually detect them and then start hunting for them.
I mean, we've been telling software engineers for years they need to put themselves into the shoes of the attacker, but I'm not sure that that's actually working, because a lot of software engineers can't think like the attackers. So, I mean...
No. Again, and it's counter to a whole bunch of documentation, but there's a real smart guy called Adam Shostak who works for Microsoft, who did a lot of thinking and writing about this. And he said telling developers to think like attackers is about as effective as telling someone, why don't you think like a chef? And he says, go. Just tell someone, bake a nice cake, think like a chef. And the answer is it's not prescriptive enough, right? Like for the stuff that I was telling you about, to the point where you tunneling data through SQL injection, through timing attacks, it's it's essentially unfair because we've spent a whole lot of time on that really niche part of the problem, while your defenders or your coders are busy working to different deadlines. And so, yeah, I don't think they could quite do that. I think there is value in doing threat modeling with your users and with your coders. And if there's anything, like if there's any one thing that I think developers should be doing is making sure they sitting with their security teams or amongst themselves doing threat modeling. So figuring out where attacks are likely to come from, what the attack's likely to look like. And the good thing that threat modeling does is it allows you to prune entire classes or entire areas of attack, right? So it doesn't matter that you don't know every type of SQL injection attack that's out there. But you kind of get to the point where you can say, well, let's assume there's attack A that is running commands on this database server. How would we contain it? How would we detect it? And sometimes you end up with broad solutions then that end up saving you. But for sure, it's something that the team needs to sit down and think about at design time.
In high security environments, unlike Yahoo, what I found is that many of the common application security defects and attacks don't work, and the attacker has to resort to attacking hosts, networks, physical premises, and of course people, as in social engineering them. Can you explain your experience around how high security environments differ from the average or low security environments?
Yeah, okay. So my honest answer is it's really easy for people to point at Yahoo and companies like that and laugh when they get popped. But for the most part, one of the dirty secrets of most security guys is almost everyone sitting in pretty horrible positions, hoping that when the attacks happen, the attacks don't happen on their watch. You're starting to see organizations that come through now with that are making smart design choices, and like I must stress here that it's still the exception rather than the norm, to find guys that are actually doing this stuff right. And you're starting to see smart companies now like Slack or Etsy or Stripe and Docker, and where they've essentially taken really smart security guys and built them into their product teams. And so what you're starting to see is hardened infrastructures from the get-go, where smart design choices mean that your security teams are actually building infrastructure that's safer for other people to use, rather than standing about telling them what they should do. But to go back to your question, how do the high security ones differ from the low security ones? The thing that I'd keep coming back to is on high security networks, they'd figure out you were there when you were there, as opposed to most average networks. Like the stat from most of these incident response companies and Microsoft and guys like that are that most companies only figure out they've been compromised between 200 and 300 days after the initial compromise. And in truth, that stat's even worse, because most of these guys figure out they're compromised because the data is kind of self-advertising. So Target figures out they're compromised because someone's using credit card data that was Target's credit card data in Mexico. But if the information itself didn't advertise, hey, I've been stolen, then it would sit unknown for an even longer period. And sometimes you don't know it until another country puts up a joint strike fighter that looks a lot like your joint strike fighter. And yeah, so that's a pretty horrible place to be in. And unfortunately, it's more the norm than it should be. Like, there's a keynote by Alex Stamos, who is the CISO of Facebook currently. And I suspect he was actually the CISO of Yahoo when he gave this talk, which is super interesting. But in his talk, he basically said if you took the Fortune 500 you could take 100 of the top 100 in that Fortune 500 and say these guys know how to play the security game. Not they invulnerable, they know how to play the game. And he said the next 400, like in his slide deck, he referred to them as the toasted 400. He said, like, these guys are broken and they don't know that they're broken for all of these reasons. And yeah, it's certainly job security for people in the InfoSec field, but it's pretty grim.
If you don't have visibility as to what's happening on your network at all levels, then chances are things are happening that you don't want happening. There are known attacks that target each of the network layers. What are some of the attacks that we need visibility on?
Yeah, so visibility is an interesting one, right? Because for a little while, all of these companies popped up selling SIEM equipment. And they took a fundamentally good message, which is you need visibility on your network, and used it to sell a whole bunch of gear that just logged everything and threw everything into data lakes. And what people are finding out now, as you enter Gartner's trough of disillusionment on the hype cycle, is that just collecting everything also isn't some sort of silver bullet. And so, like, I'm going to push slightly against the guys who, like, there's a crowd out there who say log everything because the more data you have, the more useful it is. And by analogy, you'll note, by super weird analogy, collect everything happened to be the catchphrase of the NSA when in a post 9/11 world. and one of the things that become apparent through the Snowden leaks is that logging everything wasn't particularly effective. Sure, you had all this data, and at some point, some data store knew that terrorist A spoke to terrorist B last week, but if it's hidden in haystacks of other haystacks of needles, you don't know that you've got this data and it's not actionable. And so again, my almost shortcut solution for this is that when designing visibility and detection systems like that, it's a good time to get in an attacker who actually knows what he's doing. So they used to talk about red teams and blue teams, where red teams were the attackers and blue teams were the defenders. And recently there's a rise of what they call purple teamers. So guys working on both. And it's one of the good times, I feel, to get in a purple teamer, to kind of tell you, look, so A, you do your threat modeling, or B, you take this guy and you say, look, what are the possible ways you're going to break into this thing? And then you spend a good amount of time saying, well, okay, for each of the things that this guy has said, how would we notice that thing happening? And so you design your monitoring and your alerting around the things that would have given this guy away or caught this guy. And then, although one of the things that people have been spending lots of money on for the last few years is penetration testing, network penetration testing, and it's not been largely effective. If you couple that with this detection or with this mindset, you start to see some wins where on every pen tested engagement, you can then go take the report and say, not just remediate the findings that the guys used to break in, but for every step go, well, how could I have spotted this early enough? Or how could I have spotted this guy at this stage? And then you come up with essentially ways to disrupt that attacker's flow. And inadvertently, you end up with ways of detecting bigger classes of problems, which is exactly what you want to do.
What do software engineers now need to understand about computer network technologies in order to mitigate attackers using them as a channel to assist exploiting areas of a business and gaining access to their assets?
So I think there's a few things that are worth knowing. The starting point, I think, from everything that I've said, and I mentioned before, is just that attackers will spend an incredible amount of time trying to leverage really small things to get bigger things. So it's one of those things where you really have to be careful. Like one set of creds found on a development box has been the start of unraveling many a fine network, because it's one set of creds for one database. Either you're getting goodness in that database, or you're now running with the role of that database, and that stuff spreads like crazy. But aside for that, there's a bunch of just basic hygiene that developers need to be thinking about. Like in this day and age, it's going to sound completely stupid considering we've just been talking in depth about network security. But there's a few common things that users should be doing. At this point, if you're not using a password manager, it's ridiculous, because password reuse is stupidly popular, and as an attacker, it's just such an incredible gift. Like if you own the guy and know that his creds are going to work on every other system in the network, it's an absolute pleasure. And then actually starting to use equipment that's more resistant to attack. So at this point, iOS is reasonably well locked down. We've got pretty good proxies for identifying the difference in cost of attacking an iOS device versus attacking an Android device. So if you're going to have a system that effectively is the key to your entire AWS infrastructure, maybe it shouldn't be on a jailbroken iPhone or on a Android device that you also play Flappy Bird with. And so I think there's little things like that, or little hygiene things like that developers should be thinking about, aside from obviously development security best practice, which I'm assuming everyone is keeping relatively up to date with and listening to their security teams with.
Could you just give us a bit of an intro as into what the Canary tools are and how they work?
Sure. So essentially there's two components. The one is a throwback to the 90s, like everything else I've said. And that's the fact that we have a pitch that says that honeypots were a good idea, but they were actually a good idea for breach detection. So not for studying your attacker and not for confusing your attacker. If you take any of the discussion that we've had so far, our thesis is that if an attacker compromises a host on your DMZ, one of his early steps is going to be looking around your DMZ for other hosts. And so our logic is, wouldn't it be nice if there was a box on your DMZ that looked attractive for your organization, looked attractive to an attacker, but let you know out of band the moment it was touched. And the logic is that only an attacker would be touching it. And it comes back to something interesting, which is a mistake we've been making in the industry for a really long time. And that's, if you look at traditional detection mechanisms like intrusion detection, IDS and IPSs, these products have always demoed really well, but not really worked so well in enterprises. And the reason for that is because most attacks in reality don't look like attacks. They just look like normal usage. So these IDS and IPSs, when the guy gives the demo and runs an attack tool on them, they light up and you know that there's an attack and it's all great. But when it's on your network, the attacker browsing your network just looks like a user browsing your network. And so the IDS and IPS is silent. And so what these Canary honeypots aim to do is almost reverse that, which is normal users shouldn't ever touch them because they've got no cause to. But an attacker who's unfamiliar with the terrain is going to be looking around. He doesn't know what's legit and what isn't. He touches them and they give you the alarm. And so what we've done with the Canary is we've made that ridiculously easy for people to deploy. So the logic is, hey, if honeypots for breach detection were a good idea, why aren't people doing it? And the answer is because if they've got to manage 1,000 nodes on their network, we can't tell them the solution is please add these 20 nodes except they're fake. So what Canary allows you to do is deploy mixed interactivity. So honeypots that, like if you make it a LAMP server, it really looks like a LAMP server and runs a web server and runs MySQL. Or if you make it a Windows share, it really has an SMB share with fake files on it that you can dress up. But all of that you get to set up in 3 minutes. So our pitch is you should be able to drop it in minutes and walk away from it. And at some point, it's going to call out to you because someone's touched it. And then you know that you should cancel your plans. So that's the one component, which is these Canary honeypots. And then we've got something called Canary tokens. So if your listeners go and this is completely free, if they go to canarytokens.org, essentially what you'll see there is infrastructure so that people can deploy Canary tokens or honey tokens. So the logic is totally simple. You'd go to the site and you'd say, I want a web token. Okay, if we take the simplest example. And what you do then is you put in your email address and you put in a reminder. So I'll put in a reminder that says mom's Gmail. Okay, and the system will then give you a unique URL. And what I'll do is I'll take that URL and put it in the first mail in my mom's Gmail, in her inbox. And the logic is that at some point, when someone breaks into my mom's account and is reading her email, they're going to go to mail number 1. They're going to see this link, and either their browser renders it or they click on it. And at that point, the system sends a mail to that mail address, to my mail address, that tells me somebody just clicked on mom's on the Canary token that was mom's email. And now that token is the simplest one, right, where we give you a URL. We can also give you a unique domain name. And the moment someone looks up that domain name, you'd get an alert. And with those two primitives, we can build incredibly complex tokens. So we can give you a Word doc. And the moment that Word doc is opened, it would go out and say, this Word doc has just been opened from this IP address, or a PDF file. And so essentially, we start giving you all these little tokens that you can spread about on your network or spread about on your machines and completely forget about them, right? Because it's not something you have to actively monitor, but the alert becomes self-identifying. So take that PDF file, and when you create it and say Dad's Dropbox. And essentially take that PDF file, keep it on Dad's Dropbox, and forget about it. And 4 years from now, when Dad's compromised and someone double clicks the PDF from his Dropbox, you get a message telling you someone just clicked on Dad's Dropbox PDF. Here's his IP address. And again, what you're looking for is that early warning, so you're not in that 300-day club. And so over time, we keep adding Canary tokens. So the last token that we added, for example, is an AWS API token. So essentially, you'd come to the site and you'd say, my name's Bob at bob.com, and this is a fake AWS API token that I'm keeping on my spare laptop. And you click generate, and we'll give you a set of AWS API keys. Take those API keys and store them on your safe laptop. Because when an attacker compromises, or an attacker who's worth his salt compromises that spare laptop, he's going to see AWS API creds and assume he's hit the jackpot. But the moment he uses them, our system effectively sends that email to say, someone just touched the fake API keys that you said you were storing on your spare laptop. So again, the whole idea with Canary tokens, much like canaries, is a deploy in minutes or seconds, but a high fidelity message that tells you that bad stuff is happening on your network. And yeah, so essentially that's our pitch.
What interesting personal projects or events do you have on the go currently, Haroon?
So currently, for the most part, we've just gotten back from Black Hat and DEF CON in Las Vegas. So we just wrapping up some of the research that we presented there. Some of it was around this token stuff. Currently, we playing a fair bit on what new things can be tokened, and some of them get pretty ridiculous. But an idea from a good friend of ours, from Colin Mulliner, actually goes into can you start progressively tokening binaries to let you know when those binaries are being reverse engineered by people. So figuring out that they've now hit stage 1, so they found Canary 1, but this guy's actually gone a little further. He's now in the decryption algorithm, so he's managing to hit token 2. It's an interesting idea, and it's we've got a few avenues for attack on it, so we're playing a fair bit with that. But for the most part right now, we kind of heads down. We've got a new release of Canary coming out soon, so keeping busy and keeping out of trouble for the most part.
Whereabouts can people find out more about you and what you do?
So all our Canary stuff is on the horribly chosen domain name canary.tools. And people can find us there or at thinkst.com, which is equally hard to pronounce. Or they can follow me on Twitter as Haroon Meer.
Do you have any other recent podcasts or conference talks that you think would help our listeners understand what aspects of network security we should be focusing on?
Yeah, so I've got two in a completely horrible example of self-promotion. I did a talk at Troopers a few years back called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. That's worth spending the 45 minutes of your life that you won't get back listening to. If nothing else, it paints the picture of why the problem is as bad as it is. And a follow-up talk that I gave to that paints some possible solutions for it, or at least some directions for attack. So yeah, if people want to be a little bit depressed, they should check out The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which was the Troopers keynote. And if they're interested in building products or building solutions to help dig our way out of this, they can check out a talk that I gave at T2 called Make Defense Great Again. Both of these are available on the YouTube, so I can drop you a link after this.
Haroon, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
For Software Engineering Radio, this is Kim Carter, your host.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.